Hi friends, it's Chloe. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to chat through the books that I read in the month of January. I feel like I've been hearing a fairly consistent agreement that January sucked. I didn't have the best mental health month in January. I lost my cell phone in January, which tell me how one loses a cell phone when they literally don't leave their house. Regardless of all of these things, I did have a pretty good first reading month of the year. Before we get started, if you're not subscribed already, make sure to click the subscribe button down below. Let's just get right into it. I read 15 books in the month of January and kind of all over the place in terms of ratings. I did give 5 books 5 stars, which is pretty wild that a third of the books that I read were 5-star reads, and I feel like pretty good about those 5 stars. I gave 3 books in the realm of 4 stars, 5 in the realm of 3 stars, 1 2-star, and 1 1-star. I've never given a book a 1-star rating before this month. My average rating for the month was 3.9 stars. Fairly typical, I think, if not maybe a little bit on the high side, because I did give several books 5 stars. So let's start out on one of those high notes, which is Kindred by Octavia Butler. This is my first Octavia Butler book, I think, because she primarily wrote in the realm of science fiction fantasy, which is not typically my genre, so I just wasn't sure. I get it now, and I'm super excited that I've discovered a new author that I love. Kindred is set between 2 time periods, but centers on a woman. Her name is Dana, and she suddenly finds herself time traveling between present day and a slave plantation in Maryland in the 1800s. And basically every time she goes back to this plantation, and she has no choice, no option as to when she does it, she just all of a sudden starts fading out of her current world. And every time she goes back, it's to see this one boy who is the son and then the owner of this plantation in Maryland. And every time he finds himself in trouble, for whatever reason, he brings her back in time. Obviously, a time travel book, so good, super fast paced, super interesting. And as you kind of figure out the rules of the time travel and what brings her back and forth, and as she tries to challenge those, because obviously it's not safe for her to be living as a black woman in 1800s Maryland, kind of the nuance and really complex characters that you get. And Dana in 1970s is in a relationship with a white man, and sometimes he finds himself back in time with her as well. The characters are so complex, the ideas are so complex. It's something that I'll be thinking about a lot. I'm not going to tell you anymore, but you should read this book. If you're unsure about genre, I would say don't be. Highly recommend this. Again, my first from Octavia Butler, but will not be my last. If you have recommendations as to where to go with her next, I would welcome them. The next book is Girl, Serpent, Thorn by Melissa Bashardoust. It follows our main character, Soraya, who is basically a princess, I guess, and she has been cursed from a very young age, where anybody that she touches dies, and lives a very isolated life as a result of that. Her brother is kind of the king, or the king equivalent, and is attacked by a div, or this demon one day. This demon is imprisoned in the castle, and she basically goes to speak with her to figure out if she knows how to undo her curse. Basically, the more that she tries to figure out the background of what happened to her and if she can kind of undo her curse, the more that things unravel and chaos ensues. This didn't work for me for a number of reasons. I think it was really cool just how heavily it drew from Persian culture and Persian stories. I thought that was really neat, but that was pretty much the only thing about this book that ultimately did it for me. One of the big draws to me for this book is that we have a main character, Soraya, who is attracted to people of multiple genders. This is kind of very much a fantasy that focuses quite heavily on the romance. But the thing is that the 2 prospective love interests are both not human. One is an owl woman and one is a lizard man, and I just couldn't find myself invested in relationships that were ultimately interspecies in nature. It just wasn't clicking for me. The sapphic relationship with this woman is really kind of underdeveloped and only really is hinted at for much of the book. There's a lot of kind of a she said, he said narrative, and a lot of kind of rewriting stories that are presented earlier in the book. This is what happened. No, wait, it's actually this that happened. No, wait, it's actually this that happened. And I actually just found it really confusing to follow. Ultimately, it just didn't really do it for me, and I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. The third book that I read in January that I'll talk about is The Death of Vivek by akwaeke and emezi. This is a quite short, quite quick read set in Nigeria that focuses on, unsurprisingly, the life and death of Vivek Oji, who is a young person. Their body shows up on their parents' doorstep one day. Their mother discovers it, and basically the entire book is leading up to uncovering what actually led to the death of Vivek Oji and what happened in the end. I'm not going to share much more than that because I actually think I had a little bit of an idea of what I was going into with this book, but not much, and I'm glad that I did, because I think especially because it is such a short book, and I do think it will be more impactful in many ways the less that you know. This is a book very much about gender identity, about trans identities, and family and friend and parental relationships. This book was gorgeous. It was heart-wrenching. It was absolutely devastating. I know I've seen lots of people say that this book made them cry, and I think for the first 75%, I was like, this is definitely sad, but I think I might be okay. And then the last 20 pages, I was like, dear God. I read the end of this book at a lunch break at work and really regretted it because then I had to work the rest of the day when I was kind of an emotional mess. This is one of those books I just think it is an important book for people to read, and it's one that will stick with me for a really, really long time. It was an easy 5 stars for me. I would highly recommend it. Next book on this list is Beneath the Sugar Sky by seanan mcguire. This is the 3rd book in the Wayward Children series. I won't give too much of a synopsis because if you haven't read previous books or other books in the series or don't know what it is, it's not going to make a ton of sense. But basically this series is about children, young people who can find doors to these other worlds, some of whom are kicked out of those worlds back into kind of the regular human world and have a really hard time readjusting and basically spend their entire lives wanting to go back to this world. In the 3rd book, you kind of get a follow-up from a character in the 1st book that we're introduced to and getting to actually go into her world and explore it a little bit more. This was not my favorite book in the series, but I still did enjoy it. I gave it 3.5 stars. I think the same kind of thing sticks with me for these books, which is that I'm a lot less invested in the characters or the plot and think that the worlds are much more interesting. We don't spend a ton of time focusing on that. So when we actually went into one of these worlds and got to learn more about it, I thought that was really cool. And I do think that that's kind of why maybe I liked the 2nd book the best in the series, but it was still pretty solid. I will continue on with the series. They're short novellas and they're a really cool, quick read. Next up, I will talk about 2 books together. Those are Get a Life, Chloe Brown, and Take a Hint, Dani Brown by Talia Hibbert. These are contemporary romance novels, both of which follow the Brown sisters. So Chloe is the oldest Brown sister and Dani is the middle Brown sister. And then I believe in a couple months, we are getting Act Your Age Eve Brown, which is a romance following the youngest Brown sister. I mean, these have been much hyped on BookTube, so I think anything I say isn't going to be novel or surprising, but these books are freaking adorable and just chef's kiss. Get a Life, Chloe Brown, you're following a kind of enemies to lovers, but a light enemies to lovers romance between Chloe Brown and Red, who is the superintendent in her building. Chloe Brown has chronic illness. She has specifically fibromyalgia and realizes one day that she doesn't think that she has a life, so creates a Get a Life list basically with things that she thinks she needs to do to get a life. So things like going camping or getting drunk in a bar, and Red is helping her achieve that list. In Take a Hint, Dani Brown, we are following Chloe's younger sister Dani. So she is a bisexual woman. She is a PhD candidate at a university in the UK who researches on race and gender and specifically feminist literature. So she's an icon basically, and she's friends with the security guard in the building where she works at the university. And one day there is a fire drill and she gets stuck in the elevator. So Zaf goes in to save her basically, and they emerge from the building and she's in his arms and a bunch of people take pictures and it becomes this big social media sensation, and they end up fake dating because Zaf, the security guard, is trying to get this foundation up off the ground around sports and mental health, but Dani is really adamant that she doesn't do committed relationships. Both of these books I think just do so many things right, kind of the balance between romance and steam, and the dialogue in both of these is so funny. Both of these books are laugh out loud at multiple points. I would be reading them in bed giggling, and Rob would be like, what are you doing? Both Chloe and Dani, and also the love interest, you just are rooting for them so hard. Kind of their backgrounds or their experience of marginalization not being center stage, but being a realistic and real part of their identity and how they approach romance and engage with relationships, I think is just so well done, and not kind of like a tick box, oh, we have this character who has this identity way. I think specifically with Get a Life, Chloe Brown, I've seen other people note, and I would agree with this, that the conflict in this book is a little bit whiplashy. It kind of comes at you really quick and it's resolved really quick. I don't really care, to be honest. I was so invested in the relationship that I was like, you know, this isn't perfect, but ultimately it doesn't really affect my view of the book. I gave both of these 5 stars. I love them. I love them. I think they're such good romance books. I think that if you're kind of like tiptoeing into romance, these are a great place to start. Next, I will talk fairly quickly about 3 books that I read as part of a challenge that I set for myself this month, where I would read the 3 books that were the lowest rated on my physical TBR. So for that, I read The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl by Mona Awad, and Diary of an Oxygen Thief by Anonymous. I talked about all of these more in a reading vlog, and I will link that somewhere up above if you want to hear me chat more about these books. Basically, Cabin at the End of the World. A family goes on summer vacation to a cabin. Some strangers appear with some horrifying weapons, tell them they don't want to hurt them, they just want to talk, and violence and darkness and home invasion-y apocalyptic ethical dilemmas ensue. I thought the writing was super creepy. I thought the kind of like psychological look you get into all of these different characters' minds was super interesting. The ending was ultimately very unsatisfying to me, and I do like a little bit more of a to my ending. So if you really like a good wrapped up story, you will not enjoy this, but I ultimately did give it 3.75 stars. I enjoyed it for what it was. Then 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl by Mona Awad, who was also the author of Bunny, which I really liked. This is not a character study, but you're kind of getting different vignettes of our main character Elizabeth's life as she goes from being a fat girl to a fat woman to a smaller woman after much dieting and much exercise and kind of that taking over her life. This book engages quite heavily and through the perspective of this one character with body image, with fat phobia, and the way that Elizabeth's relationship with herself and with others around her changes as a function of her body and her weight and her size. Another tough read, quite a dark read. This book I think is partially lowly rated because it seems to be kind of pitched as like a satire funny book, which I think is not really what I would be going into this expecting. It didn't really go anywhere unexpected for me, and I don't know if it's going to really stick with me, but I did appreciate it for what it was, and I gave it 3.5 stars. And then Diary of an Oxygen Thief by Anonymous. You are seeing it here because I already got rid of it. This was the worst book I've ever read in my entire life. I hated it. I hated it so much. This is a self-published book by a man who at the very beginning proclaims that he likes to hurt women, and then goes through the book talking about the different ways that he emotionally and psychologically abuses women who have romantic feelings for him. And it's as horrible as it sounds. I feel like a worse person for having read that book. 1 star feels generous. And yeah, it was a horrible experience in every possible way. When I dropped it off at the little free library, this great hardcover copy of Homegoing was there. So it was like the world was rewarding me by reading that horrible book by giving me a book that I expect to be far better. More live reactions and lots of Patty content in that video. Number 10 is Heartstopper Volume 2 by Alice Oseman. This is a graphic novel series depicting the relationship between Nick and Charlie, who were 2 boys in high school. The first volume is really kind of the very beginnings of that relationship, them becoming friends and them kind of initially discovering that they have feelings for one another. And this one is really where they kind of like cement that relationship. It's also where Nick kind of grapples more with the identity of bisexual for himself and kind of begins to come out to people, which is just like, I cried. I gave the first volume of this 5 stars, and if it was possible, I would give this volume 6 stars. It just took 2 characters that I was already loving, and it made me just love them even more. I am highly anticipating volume 3, which is out in many parts of the world, but it is not yet out in Canada. So yeah, 5 stars. Duh. Next on this list is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This book I read because everybody on BookTube reads it. Romance, heavy YA fantasy. Basically, this is about our main character named Feyre, who is a human living in this world where basically like humans are inferior to fairies or fae. I don't know if they're fae or fairies. And she kills a fairy when she's hunting one day. Her family has like no money and she needs to hunt for her family for food because her sisters and father are basically useless. And then she needs to spend the rest of her life with this other fairy to like repent as penance for killing this other fairy. She's at this fairy's house and like he's really handsome and actually not that bad, but then there's a lot of trouble in the fairy kingdom, so eventually he sends her home for her own safety. And then she realizes that he's in trouble and goes back and tries to save him, and then all of this like stuff happens. Okay, that was the worst synopsis ever, but like I'm not here to give you a good synopsis. I'm here to give you my thoughts on the book. The first like 75 pages of this book, I was like, this is steamy garbage. And I don't understand why everybody likes it so much. And by the end of the book, I was like, this is steamy garbage, but I get it. It is like Beauty and the Beast inspired. And once I realized that, I was like, oh, this makes a little bit more sense now. But it's like very much Beauty and the Beast meets Hunger Games meets Twilight. So do with that what you will. This is like a very romance heavy fantasy where because the fairy was more like human than owl/lizard, girl, serpent, thorn, I was much more invested in that relationship. I did find that it was really fast moving and easy to get through, and something that I did have an ultimately enjoyable reading experience, even though I don't think it's a good book. The main character is like kind of annoying, very much like not like other girls type character, and the dialogue is like super cringeworthy. I wrote down a couple quotes. I became aware of every pore in my body when his tongue entered my mouth. Ugh. And also the number of times that this book refers to watery bowels, that was just a descriptive image that I never ever needed. Just say diarrhea. Regardless of all of this, because the reading experience was one that I ultimately enjoyed, I did give it 4 stars. Next up on this list is Punching the Air by zoboi and Yusef Salaam. This is a YA fiction told in verse. It is about a young black man who basically there is a fight that happens in his local community and he's involved in the fight and ends up going to a juvenile detention center, even though he was like not really the one that should be going to the juvenile detention center. And he has a very creative background, so like we're telling the story in poetry, but he also relies quite heavily in art when he's in juvenile detention to try to kind of make a horrible situation somewhat less horrible. I thought that this book was really beautiful, really hard-hitting. I really like books told in verse. I'm realizing that. I think it's a really innovative and really creative way to tell stories and often kind of get at themes a little bit more implicitly, but still really impactfully. And kind of the narratives in this book around things like the school to prison pipeline, for instance, and the criminalization of young black men were like very clear, but done in a way that I hadn't seen it done before. I ultimately gave this one 4.5 stars. It came very close to a 5-star read for me. And again, like 4.5 stars is an excellent book, one I would highly recommend. I was kind of hoping for more out of the ending of this book, but I didn't kind of get quite the closure that I was looking for, but still a really solid book. A really solid YA. The next book on this list is Hood Feminism, Notes from the Woman That a Movement Forgot by Mikki Kendall. This is a nonfiction book that is basically a collection of essays. Mikki Kendall really kind of has 2 big and really important aims in this book. One, to kind of challenge and criticize white feminism and the harms that result from that type of feminism, and 2, to kind of challenge and complicate what actually constitutes a feminist issue, which I think that's one of the things that I've heard from a lot of people has been really impactful, is the way that Mikki Kendall takes things like hunger and food insecurity and income insecurity and gun violence and parenting and things that aren't always maybe top of mind for mainstream feminists, but she basically says, hey, for all of these reasons, these are feminist issues and things that the mainstream feminist movement really needs to be taking into account. My background is in gender studies and specifically in anti-poverty and income security policy. So a lot of the things that she was talking about here, my background is not in like critical race studies, but a lot of things about specifically kind of that overlap between gender and class were things that were very much on my radar already and that I actually found very affirming to read. A lot of things this book did, it did really well, and it's something that for a lot of people I would definitely recommend this to. That said, there were a couple things about this book that didn't quite hit the mark for me. It is very US focused, which is not inherently a bad thing. There were things that kind of went over my head because it was like very American focused. So talking about like a specific congressperson, and I'm like, I did find the writing a little bit hard to follow at places and quite abrupt, and the author will move quite quickly from one point to the next, and the kind of through line connecting those ideas isn't always super clear. The author definitely covers more topics in breadth than she does in depth. And one of the things that I think was the toughest for me about this book was that the author, I think, spends a lot of time unpicking why these different issues, why these different topic areas are feminist in nature and need to be considered by feminists. Once she's done that convincing, or if you come into the book convinced already, I think you're kind of left wondering what's next. That's where I would have liked to have seen this book go. And I think, again, it's hard because we're talking about how much content can you cover in a short book, and maybe that's not what everybody's going to be interested in. But I also think that, like, once people are on board with considering something like gun violence as a feminist issue, what do people advocate for? Because certain solutions are going to be more or less feminist or more or less equitable than others. And I think stopping short of certain policy prescriptions that sometimes felt like a big gap to me. So I was waiting for the entire chapter on gun violence for her to say that feminists need to be advocating for gun bans. And I didn't hear that. Similarly, talking about sex work and sex workers, there was no mentions of things like decriminalization or legalization of sex work. I gave this book 3.75 stars. Still an excellent read. Didn't hit all the marks for me, but is something that I will still be recommending to people. Again, kind of gauging where they're at on their feminist journey. Number 14 of the month is Difficult Woman by Roxane Gay. This is a fictional short story collection. The unifying theme is less difficult women and more about women who have faced very serious and very tough difficulties. This book is heavy, it is dark, deals a lot with topics like pregnancy and pregnancy loss and sexual violence and abusive relationships and just like a lot of really hard topics. I was surprised to actually see quite a bit of magical realism in this book, which was really exciting. I'm not going to talk too much about this. If you like short story collections, I would definitely recommend it. I didn't think I did like short story collections until I picked up this book, and I actually did really enjoy it. Roxane Gay can really write. There is like no questioning that. I read Bad Feminist early in 2020, and I didn't love Bad Feminist because it was quite heavily focused on like pop culture and media critique, and a lot of the subjects of analysis were not things I was familiar with. Whereas in this, I felt like I really just got to appreciate what a good writer she is and kind of the breadth and the scope of her imagination. One I would highly recommend. I gave it 4 stars. And the last book on this list is Man in Charge by Laurelin Page. You can probably guess the genre of this book by the cover, but this is a romance about a woman who works for this company that is run by her best friend that basically like sets up really fancy big corporations with nonprofit partners. And basically one of her best friends has a specific illness and she's trying really hard to find a nonprofit related to that illness, a corporate sponsor, and she finds this company that's interested, but her friend who runs the company is like, no, we can't go to that company. So she kind of like sneaks around behind her friend's back and makes a presentation anyways, and then develops this like very steamy relationship with one of the big bros at this company. This book was just like, it is what it is. It was like a steamy work professional romance, like forbidden love type book between these two characters. Had more of a plot than previous kind of romances that I've been reading. Beautiful bastard. I thought it was okay. I thought it was fine. I gave it 3 stars. I don't have much more to say about it, to be honest. I will read the sequel. And there we have it. Those were the 15 books that I read in the month of January. The highs, lows, and lots of in-betweens. Let me know if you've read any of these, what you thought. Yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Let's chat in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye!